And welcome to another edition of the Nerdy Agent Podcast, audio showing of the week. This is no longer the business tip of the week. And today we're going to talk about when you're at a house and either the shower surround, the floor tile, the backsplash tile, there is tile there, and it's been usually recently done, what to look for in that tile to see if the job's been done correctly and by a really good Tyler.
We need a new intro for this one, right? Like, we had the business tip down pat.
I know.
And we got to figure that one out.
I actually heard that 4 and 5 listeners turned off the business tip podcast after hearing Josh and AJ sing.
I actually heard that people turned it into a short audio clip and they would just listen to it on repeat.
Okay, tiles. We'll work on that next week.
You want me to talk about tile?
Yeah, what do you talk about tile?
The two things that jump out to me that I look for are specifically on a backsplash or a shower. A professional tile installer will fit their tile before they actually put it on the wall. An amateur thinks that you just start installing the tile.
Like you're reading a book.
Just go in the corner and go across.
Left to right, yeah. And what ends up happening if you do that is you end up with a really nice pattern on one side and a really crappy pattern on the other side, and you have no symmetry. So a tile install job should actually be centered on the wall most of the time. Sometimes this is kind of tricky because if you're going to end up with two really small little slivers, then sometimes you kind of adjust from there. And maybe you center a grout line rather than centering a tile. Professional tile installers obviously know how to do this stuff. But in an ideal scenario, your last tile on if you're laying it like subway tile, which is offset by half, you're going to end up with the same size tile on the left and the right at the ends.
Yep.
And one tile that is very centered at the bottom in the middle. And then you end up with a perfect offset as you go up the wall. Now, it doesn't always come out that way, but that's how it's supposed to look in that scenario. That's the majority of the tile jobs we see. Same thing applies on the floor. They should measure the room, center the first tile so that they get it all perfectly right. Now, the other thing that I think is very, very important and done wrong all the time, I've done 3 of these myself actually, are tile shower pans. So you'll often see these in a really nice owner suite where the floor of the shower is actually tile rather than like a fiberglass surround. If you are seeing those in houses, the main thing to look for is if there's any mildew or mold looking spots, especially on the outside edges where the caulking is, where the tile, the vertical tile meets the flat tile on the floor. Most folks that do these as amateurs don't understand that you need a rubber liner. OD is usually like the go-to brand for that, and it has to go 1 foot up the framing. The key here is, I think a lot of people think that tile is like waterproof somehow. It's actually very porous.
The tile itself is.
It could be depending on the material, but the grout is very porous, and that's why if you have a tiled shower and you've taken a shower and you turn all the water off and it's all drained off the surface, you should hear like a little sucking noise, because when you install these correctly, you have a pre-pitch made out of sand and Portland cement, and then you put down your plastic liner, right, or rubber liner, and then you do a post-pitch that's on the same grade as the other one, and then you lay your tile on top of that, so that when the water does inevitably go through the grout, it eventually goes through that post pitch that you did, and it lands on that plastic liner, and it has a pitch that runs it down to a weep hole that's actually underneath the tile of your floor. So that's where you'll hear that sucking noise. A lot of folks either omit the rubber liner altogether, or they don't do a pre-pitch and they lay it flat on the floor, and that's often when you'll see that mildew on the outside, because the water goes through the grout. It sits on the liner, and instead of it running towards the weep hole, it just kind of sits flat because it doesn't have any gravity to move. So again, pretty technical, but if you are looking and you see it, that's usually when you can tell it's done incorrectly. If you see a shower that has a tiled floor and you can tell the tile was not done by a professional, it's really likely that that pan was not done correctly. I've had several clients where I had one specifically like 6 years ago where I was like, you guys should replace that almost immediately because it's going to cause a leak. And then like 3 months after closing, they called me and they're like, you were right. We got a leak in our living room because we didn't replace that tile and the water got through it.
So I'm just going to go through as easy as possible when you walk into a bathroom what to look for, because AJ obviously gets really technical, and that's really good. If you can listen to that a couple times through and stand and look at a shower while you're doing it, you will understand. It makes a ton of sense. But when I go into a shower, I always look and see if the tiles on the edges are in the same line, if they're the same size. That's how you know they centered. Yep. I always want to make sure, and this isn't
so explain simply. The tile on the far right and the tile on the far left of a row are the exact same size.
Exactly.
That's the biggest thing to look for.
This isn't a deal breaker, but I do prefer, if they are tiling a shower, they're at least putting tile all the way up the wall to the ceiling.
Yep. Because
sometimes you'll see the shower head sticking out of sheetrock, and it's like that is definitely going to get moist up there when you're taking a shower. The best possible scenario, what we did at our house, is we tiled the ceiling as well, because then you're just moisture proofing the whole thing.
And then, it looks kind of cool.
It looks really cool. And then the last thing I always do is I take my hand and I just run it across the tile, because you will get a pretty good idea on how good of a tiler they were by how smooth that is. Because you'll put your hand over and sometimes you'll just be like bumping over hills. Mm-hmm. Like, this guy clearly isn't that great at this, because their thin set that they lay is super clunky and it's not done very well.
People who spend time on tile spend a lot of time planning and prepping and thinking through it.
Exactly.
Like our go-to tile guy, he's working on our shower.
So slow.
He would sit in his car and he would smoke a cigar for an hour and a half and mentally be planning out where every single tile was going to go. And then he'd come back and he'd lay a bunch of tile, and then he'd go back and sit in his car some more. It's kind of funny to watch, but like, it makes such a difference when they move slow and methodically.
So good.
And I think you notice, like, to your point, Luke, if it's not done professionally, you can tell pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. It doesn't look as good aesthetically, but more importantly, you know that what's behind the floor, behind the walls, or under the floor was probably also done incorrectly, because like, you should use a product called Red Guard. You should use cement board. Some people will just like throw sheetrock up and then stick tile on it, and it's like, it's going to just mold out and fall apart, right?
Well, it's like, and it kind of leads into the rest of the house too, right? If you feel like you can DIY tile, do you feel like you can DIY electrical? Do you feel like you can DIY plumbing?
Right.
And that's the stuff you can't see the same way. And so there's going to be typically more concerns when people are DIYing things, broadly speaking, around the house.
Let's wrap this up. So that's tile in a house, and that's the Nerdy Agent Podcast audio showing of the week.
Audio showing.
Oh gosh, we got to cut that.